Hey everyone, Once Bitten here. So I'm starting a new series of videos on Warhammer Fantasy Tactics, and I thought the first one that I would broach would be deployment. So I'm calling this Deployment 1.0 because I don't think it's everything that could possibly be said about deployment. Rather, this is maybe some approaches, some ways of thinking about deployment that I think might lead nicely into some future videos. So first off, the things that I take into consideration when thinking about deployment are: one, what's my overall strategy for the game? And that's dependent on the kind of list that I brought, my opponent's list, or at least what I know about it, the objectives of the game and the scenario, all those kinds of things. I take into consider the army synergies that I have and that I need. What are the threats that I'm worried about, and what are the counters I have to them, and how does terrain affect my decisions? So the way I think is useful to think about it are three different type of archetypes of deployment. So the first archetype I'll call set deployment. And with this approach to deployment is based almost exclusively on your list, your strategy for the game, how you think your list will work together and win the game. And it doesn't really matter what your opponent has or what he or she does or what the board looks like. You're bringing a list and a strategy that you think will win most games. So again, it's determined by the synergies and characteristics of your list. So you're usually looking at what units do I have that can work by themselves, and what units do I need to have under or near my general or near my battle standard bearer or near another unit. Are there units I have that need to work together, or is there a purpose that each unit serves? And if when I think about those things, I have a way of putting them together that doesn't depend on what my opponent does, then that determines what my set deployment will look like. I think you find these most commonly in defensively built lists. So somebody brings a range or magic heavy list. A lot of times they come to the table knowing how they're going to deploy their army. You'll see it to a certain degree when there's certain synergies that are necessary. So, for instance, somebody brings a gun line, or they bring a techless list or a Slan list. You know, they're probably know how they're going to set up when they made their list. If they're most stereotypically in an Orc and Goblin army or an Empire army, those armies can be very, very effective, but a lot of times you have to have that leadership bubble and that reroll bubble, or else it simply will not work, and your army will just scatter off the board. And one thing since I play Bretonnia that I find a lot is it's not necessarily keeping the whole army together as much as having units working together. So I might need my men-at-arms providing ranks and making sure my opponent's not steadfast, and then combining that with a Bretonnian knight unit that can provide active combat resolution so that my knights don't get caught stuck in prolonged combats. So here's a good example, a typical one. If you look up just to the right of the Stegodon, there's a Slan and a unit of Temple Guard. So there's going to be stubborn, usually stubborn rerollable, high leadership using 3 dice. You're going to have to kill that thing to a man, so to speak, and they're not easy to kill. And meanwhile, that Slan is casting spells all over the table. So what this general is doing, and what a lot of the generals with this type of list are doing, is they put their Slan with Temple Guard right somewhere near the middle of the table, put a steg right next to it, because that thing can keep some units away from combat, so that big powerful units don't come tearing in there to kill the Temple Guard off. Or if there is a prolonged combat, he can do that pulse ability of the Ancient Stegodon, no armor save, and can cast that in an area that includes units in combat. On either side of that combination, he's got 2 Saurus blocks, very common. Eventually he's going to need somebody to go in and mop up the remains of what he hasn't magicked to death. And they also, being where they are, keep the Temple Guard unit from being flanked and destroyed too easily. On the far right, he's got a unit of Cold One Saurus warriors to protect his flank. On the left, he's got some Crocscore skinks and some other skinks to maybe slow down things on this flank. And I don't think it matters who's he's facing or what the table looks like. I think the deployment would probably look pretty similar to this no matter what he does. So I think that's a very common example of a set deployment. Similarly, in the Vampire Count's army, you're going to see something like this. There's a huge block of skeletons with the vampire general right in the middle of the table. They needed a vampire to march. Units near them do. We need to make sure that general doesn't get killed, so we want to make sure he's in a unit big enough that combat res isn't going to pop him off. Then on either side, you have two very combat-oriented units with Graveguard on the right and a horde of ghouls on the left, and they probably have the regen banner. So you have a nice, real steady block of combat troops. Corpse Cart behind it, providing buffs. Wraith with Banshees on one flank. Here to the right, you can't see it, but there's a Vargulf protecting this other flank. And again, I could probably expect to see this deployment regardless of what the table looked like or what I have as his opponent. A lot of times when I see symmetry in deployment, I think that the person probably had an idea of how he was going to deploy before he put his list on the table. So here you can see the two combat blocks that he wants to get in combat. On either side are some crossbows, protecting his flank and withering his opponent down. Bolt throwers in the back, Hydra protecting the flank. And on the left flank, just out of the picture, is a unit of warriors with a spellcaster with the sacrificial dagger. So he doesn't really want that unit in combat, but he wants it near combat so he can cast spells, and it's available to help out should he need it. Again, when I see something like this, it tells me he probably had a pretty good idea how he was going to do this before I even showed up. And as the last example of a set deployment, this is one of the first games I played in 8th, and it's where I really gained an appreciation of how powerful Empire can be. But to the upper left, he's got a bunch of war machines in the corner of the table, and then surrounding it, he has a bunch of either stubborn great swords or 10 ranks deep of halberdiers, or in the woods, he's got unbreakable flagellants or an unbreakable steam tank. So he sets in the corner, has all these tough-to-move troops nearby, and again, he wasn't doing that based on anything I did. That was his plan for how his army would work. So that's it for archetype number 1, set deployment. Archetype number 2 is what I call reactionary deployment. And this is when you're thinking in terms of what you're worried about in your opponent's army and how you're going to counter that. And sometimes, especially if you play a knight-heavy army, you have to take terrain into account. So the philosophy behind this is you're looking to get good there kind of like a paper, scissors, rock. The danger here, and I find myself falling into this trap all the time, is there can be a tendency to want to paper, scissors, rock the whole list, and then you start thinking, I want to kill everything in his list, which is a very good way to lose a game. What you want to do is figure out a way to kill more than your opponent kills, and that's how you actually win the game. This is dependent on knowledge of your army and of your opponent's army, and it's usually driven, again, from my experience, based on what you fear. There have been armies, and in particular some specific units in armies that have torn me apart before, and so when I know I'm facing them, I tend to start thinking this way, of how am I going to counter those specific units. Most commonly with me, I've got the Bretonnian Lord with Heroic Killing Blow, so when my opponent puts a giant across the table, well, I'm reacting to it, and I'm going to put this character here, because the giant is going to wreak havoc among my knights or my men-at-arms or whatever he decides to go against. He's going to wreak havoc. But my general is that's my way of countering that. In big games, a lot of times it's tough to have a set deployment because there's just so many points and so many things that go on the table. This is a 5,000 or 6,000 point game I played, and if you look at it, you can actually kind of see how I was deploying in counter to what he was doing. So on the right, he has Chaos Knights, so I wanted my Peg Knights to be able to redirect them, and I wanted to get a dragon in their flank. I also like my Peg Knights against his Ogres there right next to the Chaos Knights. He's got 2 blocks of infantry, so I needed 2 blocks of steadfast men-at-arms with a block of Knights of the Realm to provide the kills I'm going to need to break them. Over here, he placed a Mana Core as well as a giant Shaggoth here on the flank, and if you look in the far right of this picture, it's my general. I did not want to put him all the way in my flank, but I had to put him near enough to those things so that should he come across the table, I would have some counter to it. It also prompted me to put my Knights Errant on this side of the table as a counter to those big monsters. And the third archetype is kind of like reactionary but in reverse, and this is what I call influencing deployment. And this is where you're still working with threats and counters, but now it's what does your opponent fear, and how can I make this play into my overall strategy? So again, you're trying to control your opponent's deployment, you're trying to feed their fear. This tactic or this approach to deployment can also be used to provide misdirection to get you an overall advantage in the game. It kind of assumes that they know your army in some instances. So if I wanted to influence where his giant was going to go, he would have to know that my general has heroic killing blow, or else it just doesn't matter. And again, the danger here is assuming that you need to direct their entire army deployment, and that's just going to be an exercise in frustration. Rather, what you're trying to do is just influence some particular aspect of it. So in this case, I had so fewer units than this Warriors of Chaos army I'm playing that I had to deploy my characters before he had to deploy his Hell Cannon. And when I looked at the table, I realized I really did not want his Hell Cannon way off on my right side, because there was nothing I had that would be able to go after it. So what I did is I put my Heroic Killing Blow Lord on the right side, which prompted him to put his Hell Cannon on the left side, and now I can send my Peg Knights over there to tie up his Hell Cannon for a few turns. Similarly here, this is the same list where I said earlier I used it as an example of set deployment. I knew that he was going to put his Hydra down somewhere, probably on the flank of his lines. I did not want the Hydra to be able to sit in those woods and be steadfast and force dangerous terrain tests on my knights going after it, and then my knights couldn't be steadfast in the woods. I just didn't want that, so I put my general on the Hippogriff on the left-hand side, hoping that his Hydra would have to go, he would put his Hydra on the opposite side, which doesn't really stop me. I can still fly over, but I like to think that maybe my putting my general there influenced his choice to move his Hydra away from the woods. In terms of misdirecting, when I play my Bretonnians, I very often use a weighted flank strategy, but in order to make it work, your opponent can't be directly across the table from you using the same weighted flank, or else it's totally pointless. So what you can't see in this picture off to the far left, I have a unit of Pegasus Knights, which I placed first. Then I placed, I believe, Fast Cav over there, and then I placed these bowmen on the far left. And by those deployments, I think my opponent thought that I was going to be on that side of the board, and so you can see where he set up. And then I set up the whole rest of my army on the right. And you can see 3 units here, and I have more units to the right of it. And I like that with knights because I can use my superior mobility to sweep around the flank and hit his units, gang up on his units. So 2 of mine against 1 of his. And again, it's more of an influencing strategy when you're trying to make him think you're going on one side and then you go on the other side. Now I call those archetypes because I really think that if you follow any of those too strictly, that overall it won't work very well. So what I really think that good players do is they follow a hybrid deployment strategy, and that is they focus on all those things, the overall strategy, the army synergies, threats, counters, terrain, and they have really elements of a set deployment, i.e. they come to the table knowing how their army is going to work together and how they're going to try to keep their army together, but at the same time they know what it is that could cause problems for their approach and how they're going to counter it, and they just take other things into consideration, including misdirecting their opponent. So let me give you what I thought was a great example of that. This is from a poster called Saint of Virtue, who posts a lot on Round Table of Bretonnia. He writes some excellent tacticas. He wrote this quote is from a battle report he did from a tournament game, his Bretonnians versus a High Elf list. And I think the thinking that he shows I thought was fantastic. And I think although it's primarily reactionary, he demonstrates a very nice hybrid approach as well. So he starts off saying that he sees there's a building. He assumes his opponent's going to put archers and a mage in that building. And so he decides, well, I don't think that's much of a threat. It's a secondary target. Eagles aren't too much of a threat, but they are a threat to my trebuchets. White lions, ooh, he's got a Death Star, so that I need to make sure I avoid it. He's got a Sea Guard unit, which isn't too big of a deal because of my knights, but he does have a prince on a dragon, and that's huge, so that needs to be my focus. So then he just talked about his deployment. So he said, well, my opponent set down an eagle, so I put my bowman directly across from it, because bowmen are a great way to take out an eagle. Then my opponent set down his second eagle right next to his first. Well, at that point, the only thing he's worried about is eagles getting into his trebuchets, so he put his two trebuchets on the opposite side of the table. His opponent placed the Sea Guard, so he put his Battle Standard Bearer and Knight of the Realm unit across from the Sea Guard, because he knows that that Knight unit can take out that unit of Sea Guard. His opponent puts his archers in the building, and this is where he assumes that he's going to put his mage. So here he put his men at arms near it, not just to go after those archers, but to misdirect where his opponent thinks his battle line is going to be. So then his opponent finally has to put down his Death Star, puts White Lions down, and again he puts his Grail Knights down near enough to them so it looks like there is counter. But Grail Knights into the face of a large White Lion unit is not going to go well for the Grail Knights. So he's putting them down, in my mind, thinking that he's going to have them there as a threat, but he's going to keep away from those White Lions until he's got enough supporting units to come help out, or the White Lions have been withered down to a manageable level. Then finally his opponent has to put down his prince and his dragon, so then Saint of Virtue places his Pegasus Knights and his Lord with Knights of the Realm, who the Lord has Heroic Killing Blow, in a way that the Pegasus Knights can tie it up in combat and allow the Lord to get a flank charge in there, or at least a counter charge in there to take out the dragon. And so in my mind, I can see that he has a plan going in. He knows how his army is going to work. He knows what the two main threats are, which are the White Lions and the dragon. He has counters to them, and he uses influencing tactics and trying to misdirect so his opponent thinks he's going somewhere, and then he can put his units somewhere else to get the charges and the matchups that he wants. So again, those are, I think, the main approaches to deployment. Again, there's a lot of specific strategies that could be used, and I may do a tactical video about those in the future. But overall, as far as I can see, the main things that you should consider when deploying are: what are your overall strategies for the game, what are your army synergies, what are the threats you're worried about and the counters you have available to them, and how is terrain going to influence that. And I suggest a hybrid approach, which includes ideas for a set deployment, ideas for how you're going to be reactionary, and ideas of how you want to influence your opponent's deployment. So there you have it. There's a deployment 1.0. Please give me feedback on any insights you have, if you like this, or if you think there are other things I should consider, especially in future videos. And again, if you like these videos, please like, favorite, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. Hope you enjoyed it.